All right, what's up, everybody? Miss Lynch here, and this is part 2 of chapter 10. Man, I just scratched my face and it's super red. Okay. Alrighty, so like I said, I would pick back up with nation, section, and party. So that's where we're at. Okay, last thing I had talked about was the Missouri controversy and the Missouri Compromise, which brought up the debate over should slavery be extended into the expanding new states and territories, okay? And Missouri happened to be that territory, so that's where we were. Okay, so nation, state, and section is now where we are at. So this kind of will take us outward, see what's going on elsewhere in the world. Okay. So the United States and the Latin American Wars of Independence, okay? So between 1810 and 1822, Spain's Latin American colonies rose in rebellion and established a series of independent nations. Okay, so unlike the US where we went with the state system, right? They did not. Okay, so 17 different nations were created. Such as Mexico, Venezuela, Ecuador, Peru, okay? And by 1825, Spain's once vast American empire had been reduced to the islands of Cuba and Puerto Rico, right? And this inspired a wave of sympathy in the U.S., right? So, 1822, the Monroe administration became the first government to extend diplomatic recognition to the new Latin American republics. And there were parallels that existed between the Spanish and American revolutions, and the one that had given birth to the United States. That's a weird way of putting that. Anyway, sorry. Okay, but yeah, there are parallels between these revolutions, what I was trying to say. So in some ways, Latin American constitutions were more democratic than the U.S. Constitution. They allowed first Americans and free African Americans to vote. So there's that. Okay, and these wars of independence lasted longer than the American Revolution. So sometimes more than a decade. They were also more destructive. Okay, and it was difficult for the newly established nations to achieve economic development. Okay, so the Monroe Doctrine. All right. Fearing that Spain would try to regain its colonies that are all becoming independent nations, John Quincy Adams, who was Secretary of State, drafted the Monroe Doctrine, okay? This is 1823. He drafted a section of the president's annual message to Congress. So this stated that there would be no new European colonization of the New World. The U.S. would abstain from any European wars, so no more getting involved, and Europeans should not interfere with new Latin American republics, okay? Okay, so yeah, this is referred to as America's Diplomatic Declaration of Independence, and it was the cornerstone of American foreign policy for decades, until we start intervening more. Okay, so the election of 1824. Oh, that's a typo, that's fine. Okay, so Andrew Jackson was the only candidate in the 1824 election to have any sort of national appeal. He won 43% of the vote. Okay, none of the 4 candidates received a majority of the electoral votes, so it then fell to the House of Reps. And we don't have to talk about the rest of this because this is who everyone was supporting. Anyway, okay. So let's get to the nationalism of John Quincy Adams, who was elected. Okay, so John Quincy Adams enjoyed one of the most distinguished pre-presidential careers. He had a clear vision of national greatness. He supported the American system. He wanted to enhance American influence in the West. He supported expansionism. Okay. Yeah, and he stated that liberty is power. Okay, so his plans alarmed many, and his vision would not be fulfilled until the 20th century. Okay, so Martin Van Buren and the Democratic Party. Alrighty. So Adams' political rivals emphasized things like individual liberty, states' rights, and limited government. And Jackson's supporters began to organize for the election of 1828, pretty much as soon as he took office. Okay, so Martin Van Buren, who was a senator from New York, supervised this task, and he viewed the political party competition as necessary and a positive influence to achieve national unity. Okay, he hoped to reconstruct Jeffersonian political alliances. Okay, so Adams represented old politics, Van Buren represented new, and party competition provided a check on those in power and offered voters a real choice in elections. Okay, so by 1828, Van Buren had established the roots of the Democratic Party. Okay, so Andrew Jackson ran against John Quincy Adams. Okay, so 1828 had a larger voter turnout than ever before, and Jackson won a resounding victory, okay? So Jackson was a nationalist, believed that states, not D.C., should be the focal point of government activity. Alrighty, and then this takes us into the age of Andrew Jackson. So, all right, our party system. Okay, so politics had become a spectacle by that point already. Okay, so yeah, national conventions begin, and our first parties that develop are the Democrats and the Whigs, all right? So they differed on issues that emerged from the market revolution to tension between national and sectional loyalties. So Democrats were alarmed by the widening gap between social classes. They favored no government intervention in the economy. This attracted aspiring entrepreneurs who resented government aid to established businessmen, as well as large numbers of farmers and city working men suspicious of corporate enterprises. All right, so the Whigs supported government promotion, so they just supported everything that the Democrats were against. Okay, so Whigs promoted, supported government promotion of economic development through the American system. They believed that via tariffs, a national bank, and aid to internal improvements, the federal government could control economic development. This is mostly strongest in the Northeast. Okay, many slaveholders supported the Democrats, believing states' rights to be slavery's first line in defense. So we'll talk about that more as we go, but early on that's happening. Okay, so if I can turn my page here, there we go. All right, so public and private freedom. All right, the party battles of the Jacksonian era reflected the clash between public and private definitions of American freedom, their relationship to the government. So Democrats supported a weak federal government, championing individual and states' rights. We had talked about this. The Whigs felt that a strong federal government was necessary. They rejected the premise that government could not intervene, or must not intervene, I should say. Okay, and during the Jackson administration, popularly elected local authorities enacted numerous laws, ordinances, and regulations that tried to shape public morals by banning things like sex work and alcohol. Okay. Okay. So let's talk about South Carolina for just a second, and then we will get into Indian removal, okay, which is Andrew Jackson's main legacy, in my opinion, okay? All right, so Jackson, but back to South Carolina. Okay, Jackson's first term was dominated by a battle to uphold the supremacy of federal over state law. The tariff of 1828 raised taxes on imported manufactured goods made of wool, as well as on raw materials like iron. This was largely opposed in the South, specifically South Carolina. Okay, and they led the charge for a weakened federal government, in part from fear that a strong federal government might act against slavery, which we, in the past, talked about the Carolinas and Georgia being the stronghold for American slavery, right? So this makes sense that there would be this retaliation coming out of South Carolina, right? Okay. Now then, let us talk about Indian removal for just a few. Again, looking in the South, what's going on there? There are lots of plantations being run on enslaved labor, and there is westward expansion going on. So people are wanting more land to have larger plantations, all right? So land in the South is coveted, to say the least, okay? All right, so the expansion of cotton and slavery led to pressure of remaining indigenous American land holdings in the Southeast, okay, and forced relocation with the Indian Removal Act of 1830. Okay, so this provided funds for uprooting the, as they will become known, the 5 civilized tribes, okay? So like I said, this is happening in the Southeast, and this affected approximately 60,000 people living in North Carolina, Georgia, Florida, Alabama, Mississippi. Let me just see real quick if I made a note. I did not. Okay. There's definitely a map in the book about this. I just don't know what page. Okay, anyway. All right, so of our groups that come to Oklahoma, the 5 civilized tribes, the Cherokee Nation took the lead in this with the development of a written language, schools, and laws. They also adopted the European model of farming, and many Cherokees also owned slaves, which is something that will, that fact will come up at the end of the Civil War, the fact that Cherokees owned slaves. But anyway, okay, so the Jeffersonian idea that quote-unquote civilized first Americans could be assimilated, so adopting farming, adopting European education models, okay, things like that. So this goes back to this Jeffersonian idea, okay? Jackson repeatedly referred to first Americans as savages, quote-unquote, and supported Georgia's effort to seize Cherokee land and to nullify the tribe's laws. Okay, not recognizing them as sovereign nation, okay? Okay, so the Cherokees went to the Supreme Court to protect their rights that were guaranteed in treaties provided by the federal government. And this forced the Supreme Court to clarify the unique states of First Americans, which is interesting because that is happening this year in 2020. That's come about in regards to prosecution for crimes committed on tribal lands if it is to be handled by whichever nation, or if it's, state or federal. Okay, so the things that are still kind of being discussed today in different areas, okay? But so this goes to the Supreme Court and, forces them to clarify exactly what they meant with past stipulations, okay? So we have our first case is Johnson versus McIntosh. This takes place in 1823. And the ruling of this was that the Supreme Court proclaimed that First Americans were not in fact owners of their land, but merely had a quote-unquote right to occupancy. And Chief Justice John Marshall claimed that First Americans were nomads and hunters, not farmers, based on his own thoughts there. And this was a serious blow against First Americans' efforts to retain their lands, okay? So that case is very detrimental to First Americans, okay? So that's 1823. Then in 1831, there is the case of the Cherokee Nation versus Georgia. So again, Justice Marshall, he stated that First Americans were wards, so therefore responsible, they had to answer to the federal government. Although they don't actually own their own land, you still have to answer to the federal government, right? Okay, so they're wards to the federal government. It was believed that they deserved paternal regard and protection. And that they lacked the standing of citizens that would allow the Supreme Court to enforce their rights. Okay? So the justices could not therefore block Georgia's effort to extend its jurisdiction over the tribe. Okay, so these cases were just laying the foundation for, just to make it easy. It would lay the foundation to make it as easy as possible to remove these people from this part of the country, okay? Okay. Again, in Georgia, okay? So this is mostly, we're talking about the Cherokee people at this time. So there's the case of Worcester versus Georgia. So the court shifted, this one, holding that American Indian nations were a distinct people, typo there, with the right to maintain a separate political identity. They must be dealt with by the federal government, not the states, which is contributing to the conversation that's happening in 2020, right? Okay, so Georgia's actions violated Cherokee treaties with the federal government under this, and Jackson refused to recognize the ruling, of course. Okay, so the majority of Cherokees, of Cherokee peoples agreed to cede their land to remain peaceful and make that transition. If it was inevitable, then to make it as peaceful as humanly possible, all right? Where was I? Okay. This idea was promoted by Cherokee Chief John Ross so that no more violence would come on these people that was already being placed upon them, okay? Okay, so John Ross, he was the principal chief under the Cherokee Constitution. He led the Cherokee resistance movement throughout this. And yes, that agreement to cede land was their way of adopting a policy of passive resistance, okay? Okay, so federal troops were forcibly, were used to forcibly remove Cherokee people from their land under Martin Van Buren, so Jackson's successor. And this is what is known as the Trail of Tears, okay? The actual name that was given to it translated to the trail in which we cried. So that's where we get the name. And this was the route that, okay, so let's look at these numbers. 18,000 Cherokee men, women, and children. So 18,000 people made this trek from Georgia to what is Oklahoma today, so eastern Oklahoma. So of that 18,000, about 25%, approximately, 25% of those people died during this this march, this death march, right? So removed to Oklahoma, okay? So looking at the 1830s, most Southern tribes departed their homes peacefully. Okay, so this passive resistance, ceding of land, this is mostly how this era plays out, okay? Really, the exception to this rule is with the Seminoles in Florida. Okay, so with the assistance of escaped slaves, they fought a war against removal. This went on from 1835 to 1842. So in the Florida swamplands is where this played out. Okay, this is referred to as the Second Seminole War. Okay, so on each side of this, during this war, each side lost about 1,500 people. And at the end of it, 3,000 people were forcibly removed. A small amount would remain in those areas because it was deemed unwanted. It was swamp. So basically, federal government was just like, okay, well, if you really want to stay, then okay. But so this represented a small percentage of the Seminole Nation, okay? Okay. So lastly, for chapter 10, economy and panic. Okay, so cotton declines, exports decline in the 1830s. There's a panic and a depression that will go on from 1837 to 1843. Going back to the Trail of Tears, that played out under Van Buren's administration. So Martin Van Buren was elected in 1836. He was forced to deal with the depression, like I said, that panic and depression that had been going on. So he separated the federal government from the banking system, which would be repealed and reinstated, which then even going up to the Great Depression in the 30s, that's still an issue, right? Okay. Okay, so William Henry Harrison is elected and wins the presidency, ends up having the shortest presidency ever. Okay, he contracted pneumonia and died exactly 1 month after getting the job. So he was in office from March 4th to April 4th of 1841. So John Tyler succeeded him, who he himself has a troubled presidency, and we'll talk about in chapter 11. So, yeah, chapter 11, we'll pick up with John Tyler. So, okay, that is all of that. If you all have any questions about anything, please feel free to email me. And otherwise, I will see you back for chapter 11. If there's anything important, I will email or post about it. So other than that, you guys are good. So I'll quit saying so, and I will see you later. Okay, bye.